Hi and welcome to the next part of this tutorial series. My name is Tobias Tabasco. Now that we have this this blending material, virtual texture blending material set up, we can just add more assets from Quixel directly into Unreal and see how it looks. I'm just going to export a few rocks and then see how these look in the scene. In theory, all of it should blend nicely together. Okay, I've imported all of these meshes into my scene, and yeah, we can just experiment with them, just drag a few in, see how they look. Is that actually the one that I already had in the scene? Oh. And in theory, the material blending should already be applied, but I think some of them are not using this displacement material that we added it to. We've only added it into this Megascans displacement material. But for example, this one here uses a fuzzy shading as well. And it's not in there, so we can just add our material function into that one as well. Preferably before the fuzz shading. Material function, virtual texture blending. And then it nicely blends as well. The fuzzy shading is a bit of a weird one. I think I don't always like how the fuzzy shading works. So I'm inclined to just switch this over to the displacement one. Of course, you could do the fuzzy shading and the displacement both together. And with displacement, we would of course need to assign our displacement map. And the displacement, I think we haven't actually used that yet on meshes. If we go into the wireframe, we can see that they are not really tessellated yet. That's just the loss switching, so we would need to change some values here to actually displace them. Maybe in the material this is actually not correctly applied here, the tessellation. It is, but this value is super low. And I think we want the PN triangles. And now our displacement works correctly. So without displacement, I think you just get a bit more of a detail there. Same goes for these rocks. I think we just want to enable the displacement basically on all of these rocks. Here they should already be enabled with the displacement being set correctly. Then we're actually getting like a lot more of these rough surface details here from this mesh. So without displacement looks like that, and with proper value I think it looks much nicer. Okay, and then we can of course start slowly building a scene with all of the assets that we have. Some of them look really, really nice, like I really like some of them. Whoa, this is a massive boulder. And I think what I want to do is dress up this center area here. So I'm basically using displacement everywhere because I think it just looks so much better. Okay, I'm gonna get rid of all of these boxes here that I added originally into the scene, because I'm gonna build a proper scene now. It's not selecting this glass for me, by the way, so with T you can toggle the transparent selection on or off. Okay. I've cleaned up my scene a little bit. These can all go into a new folder, to environment. This one here, I will create a new folder called lighting. Always keep your scene nice and tidy. I think it always helps to do that. These directional lights and the skylight we can all move into the new lighting folder. Didn't even know we had this point light still in the scene. I mean, of course, at some point we are going to need to tackle lighting properly, because lighting changes, of course, the entire look of the scene. I actually prefer to also enhance the skylight a tiny bit. I think at first glance this might look a bit bright, but I think it reflects nature a little bit better, because we're kind of simulating a bit more global illumination by increasing the skylight brightness. And also later on in the post-process we can still adjust all of these darker shadows and areas. We can adjust all of them in post, basically. Here the moss parts and so on, they kind of don't add up correctly. So we can also alter the albedo slightly to get a bit closer to our moss that we have here. Maybe 1.1 in the saturation, and then we change the hue slightly to a more yellow. One thing that you might notice when playing around with these assets is that if you drag multiple assets into each other, they will not blend with each other, because the virtual texture blending only works on the landscape, because we've only set it up to work on the landscape. And you can fix that by adding an additional virtual texture, basically doing exactly the same setup again. But that is a bit more complicated to set up and to make it work properly. So I'm not going to do that now. I think for me the landscape blending is enough. Okay, one last thing that I want to show you before I'm going to start building my own little scene here, is that we can blend all these Megascan surfaces together as well via vertex colors, not only like with the landscape material, but also via vertex colors. And to do that, we just have to select the ones that we want to blend together. I just added a filter here for my materials. So if you go right click here on these filters, or go on filters, and then material instances, I added that one. And then you can toggle it on off to filter by asset type. And then I'm just gonna select the ones that I want to blend together. In this case, these three, which are the landscape materials as well, which I've just used there. And then once we have selected those, go into Megascans here and then create blend material. You can choose a name for that. I'm just gonna say blend material ground, and change the folder location. I changed this to Megascans and then blend materials. Then hit create blend material, and it automatically creates a blend material for you. If we assign that to the plane, it of course looks exactly like our ground. Who would have thought? And if we open the material up, we can see that there is a base layer, a middle layer, and a top layer, and even a puddle layer, which we can enable here. Use puddle layer. And right now it's just using the base layer, as we haven't painted anything in vertex colors on top of this. But if we go onto the mode mesh paint, we select that one, and then go on paint, By the way, don't change this one here. For me, it always crashed if I changed this color view mode. So I'm not doing this right now. I think it depends on the asset you have selected. It doesn't crash for all of them. Yeah, so don't select that. Then we can start painting on our mesh. So here under channels, we can select the channel we want to paint. And then white is nothing right now because everything is already white. But if we change this to black, then you can start painting on the mesh. And you will instantly see that we are now painting our middle layer, I think is that. And if we change this to green and not red, we are painting our top layer. And you can also change the blending. For example, if we would add the displacement maps back in, it should use these displacement maps to properly blend between the meshes. So I'm just going to add these displacement maps back in for all three of those. We don't have ambient occlusion, but I don't think we need this either. And then we can also adjust the displacement of this. It will displace all of the entire mesh at the same time. And that's just because for some reason this mesh is just not tessellated at all. But in theory you also have displacement on this, which is really nice, I think. And one last thing that I want to show you is the puddle layer. And the puddle layer is if you paint blue, then you will get puddles. If we paint this on our plane, come on, there we go. You can see that we have some nice water going on in the scene. And preferably I'm going to add a plane that is a bit more tessellated. I think we have none in the project if I filter by aesthetic meshes. I don't think we have a plane there that is highly tessellated. Maybe this one. Seems to be more tessellated. We will get some nice puddles. And if we start painting in some rocks as well on this mesh, let me increase the brush size slightly. You will also notice that this kind of blends with the height of these layers. So the puddle layer kind of blends into this rock layer really nicely here. You can see that the rock layer is kind of higher here, and then the puddle layer will kind of recognize this height. You can change the liquid height, for example. If I would change this to something a bit lower, you can see that it goes down. So if we would have a proper ground material, these puddle layers would look really, really nice. I'm going to set this up in my scene to have a bit of a puddle in there. Also change the tiling of each one of these layers individually. So if I want to change the tiling of that one, for example, oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. My middle layer, can of course change the tiling. And maybe a bit more displacement here. I think we can also change the displacement of each layer individually. If we tick this box, individual displacement values, then we get under displacement here, we get these displacement sliders basically. So yeah, just wanted to show you that. So this is another way of really quickly getting nice detail into your scene with one of these vertex blended materials. This is of course more for the bespoke scenes now. So if you would create a proper ground, like a mesh as a ground and not the landscape, then you can use this vertex blending to really get nice fine detail into your scene. I think we are ready to build our scene. I'm just going to build my own little scene here, and then I can share the end result with you. And yeah, I'm curious what you guys can come up with, and I'm curious to see your scenes as well. So yeah. So I created a small time lapse of exactly how I'm building my scene, just so maybe you guys can learn something from it. It's kind of all the techniques that I've already shown you, so there's not a lot of new stuff in there. There is a few things that I've done which we haven't covered yet, and I'm going to talk about that in one of the following episodes. So first of all, of course, I just took a lot of assets from Megascans because we just needed a lot more assets, like different rocks and kind of like some surface materials, grass. I think foliage we haven't really done that much yet, but I'm gonna do an episode on that one, how to create the procedural foliage. And yeah, and then I just started painting in some different surface textures of that detail area, which we covered in basically in this session, just to get some nice ground materials going on there. And I also tried to paint in some puddles, which it kind of worked okay, but I didn't like that the puddles weren't flat but kind of conformed to the surface. So later on I switched to actual water, like to the new water that Unreal ships with the water plugin, and I'm going to show that to you later on as well. And then I kind of like, after I've done a base setup of my area, I kind of put in some lights, because I think it always kind of helps to see lights in the scene. You know, it kind of makes everything feel a bit more grounded and natural. And there's been some issues, as you can see here, with ray traced shadows and the landscape. I think that has again to do with tessellation. So if tessellation is enabled in the landscape, kind of the ray traced shadows don't work properly. So yeah, I had to disable ray traced shadows on my lights, which is a bit of a bummer, but yeah, it's always a trade-off, right? So yeah, for now I have disabled those. And then, because a lot of people were asking about how we can add maybe a snow layer into our scene, I've basically created just another layer like we did with the moss and the rocks and so on for the landscape. And yeah, added some blending that just blends depending on height. I'm going to cover this in a future tutorial so that you know exactly what I'm doing there, and I'm going to show you how my material is set up. But it's basically exactly what we have been doing, just with a height blend instead of, for example, the slope blend that we added. Yeah, and then I kind of, instead of just doing a height blend, I also combined a slope blend with the height blend, so that you kind of get this nice snow detailed just on top of surfaces, but not on the sides, if that makes sense. And yeah, then of course you have to adjust the tiling for the snow and so on and so forth. Also, while playing around with this, I kind of realized that, of course, we also want to break up the tiling artifacts here that we can clearly see in the snow, and of course also in our moss grass texture. So I also implemented some ways of breaking up that tiling. You can kind of see it here. It's very hard to spot. And I'm going to show you some techniques how to break up the tiling as well. That's going to be most likely in the next tutorial. And the snow material, I also added it to the rocks, because it's just a layer, so you can basically add it to the landscape, but you could also add it to the rocks, so that the rocks are also affected by the snow. I think you can't see that right now, but I'm going to do that later on. And yeah, here you can see me kind of just playing around with the mask to kind of get the right amount of snow and so on. And then I added a global parameter, so I can just adjust the height of the snow in one parameter, basically. And I think it's just also important to have a lot more variety in the scene, you know, like just bring in more and more assets, one at a time, like just some rock cliffs to kind of break up these silhouettes of what you kind of get with only having the landscape. I think it's nice to sometimes have some actual really detailed meshes and so on in there. And then I started just bringing in some basic rocks, and there's a technique that I use for that, which utilizes the physics system of Unreal. One thing to keep in mind when doing that is that rocks from Megascans, or like nearly any assets from Megascans, they don't really have collision at all. So you need to add some collision first to those, and then you can just basically simulate the physics. So I just place loads of rocks on top of each other, then simulate the physics so that they kind of accurately fall down. And here you can see me doing that with like loads and loads of rocks. It's probably not the most performant technique, but I think it gives you kind of really nice results, like natural looking results for rocks. And yeah, then once the rocks fall down, you kind of you have to drag them a little bit more into the ground and so on, because the collision, of course, doesn't makes it not go into the ground and so on, but it will look more natural if you just shift it tiny bit into the ground. And yeah, I just do that for a lot of rocks of different sizes and so on, just to scatter a lot of debris and rocks into this scene to make it look a lot more natural. And here I'm just shifting rocks that I find like kind of obvious in the air because of the collision not being accurate, kind of shifting them all into the ground. And one thing that you can do to optimize this is to create mesh instances out of this static meshes. So right now they are all static meshes, but you can create instances. So you kind of create batch instances of all of these rocks to make this perform a lot better. I'm not doing this in my example because I think I should have approached this a bit differently in the first place, and I just went for it. And it's not the most optimized scene. But yeah, if you want to optimize this for games, you can of course create instances for this. Instances are a lot cheaper because it kind of only has to calculate the transformation and not any of the other stuff. Like it's just one draw call. So you can read up on that. It's called hierarchical instance static meshes, or just instance static meshes. I'm gonna do a video on this as well, like on how to scatter these physics around. Basically, I'm going to do one video that covers all the things that I haven't covered so far in the previous tutorials. And yeah, and then it's always important to just run around with your character and test how it looks and so on and so forth. And here you can see, unfortunately, my Unreal crashed there, but I've also put in the water, the actual water there, which kind of utilizes the new Unreal water system. It's basically just a plane with the water shader applied, so it's really quite simple. The water shader is provided by Epic already as kind of like an example. So yeah, I can show you how to do that as well, but we're also going to have an entire tutorial on water anyway, so maybe we can cover it then. I just really like the look that the actual water gave me compared to having the puddles painted. That's why I chose to have actual water, because it kind of feels like it has actual depth to it, you know. Another trick that I do is kind of put some very large meshes in the background rather than using the landscape, because they kind of have a lot more surface detail. They feel more detailed. And if they are really far away in the background, you can't, like, I think it you can't see that they are actually meant to be way smaller, but they look quite nice regardless. And especially because we do this snow on top of it, I think that kind of also really supports this illusion of having snow on it. And you don't see that these meshes are actually supposed to be way smaller. So yeah, just fleshing out the scene. I've added like a light portal there because I think this is really the look I wanted to go for, with kind of like this a little bit more sci-fi light portal in the middle of the scene. And then yeah, I just basically rotated my sun downwards so I get this nice orange look because of the atmospheric scattering. And the portal itself is kind of like a blue, so you get this nice contrast of having the orange sky and the blue light portal. And of course you will get the reflection on the water then from the light portal, which also looks really nice. And yeah, then I started playing around with foliage, as I said earlier. And there's kind of this thing called procedural foliage volume. So it procedurally generates foliage depending on what kind of parameters you put in there. Quixel also has a nice tutorial on that. And they have some presets in their latest work as well. In the Medieval Village, you can kind of take a look at the procedural foliage presets that they have there. And yeah, I just added like some basic grass and some flowers and so in there one at a time. And yeah, then I took these volumes, put them in the level, and of course the colors are not always correct, so you kind of have to adjust colors a lot to make the whole scene look a bit more unified. I always take a look at the unlit mode to do this, and so that the lighting doesn't really affect the colors. And then in the unlit mode, if you adjust it, it's kind of going to look okay once you switch back to lit mode. And yeah, it's just altering the colors slightly to make it all look a bit more uniform. And then, yeah, just bringing in a bit more of that foliage. I've adjusted the draw distances slightly because the performance was really going down at this point. If you show all of this foliage, like you can really see your FPS dropping. You can see mine are at about 10 right now. And that's why I really adjusted these draw distances so the foliage doesn't draw as, like it kind of lots quite fast. So in the background, you don't have that much foliage, but I think that's fine. There's always some like back and forth between performance and looks, right? And yeah, then it's just minor adjustments, getting the subsurface scattering right on the foliage, for example, how the light falls through it and so on. You can just adjust the shader. And I think I also disabled the skylight ambient occlusion on the foliage because I think it made the entire scene look too dark. Yeah, but as I said earlier, I'm gonna do an entire tutorial on foliage as well. And yeah, at the end, I kind of just basically by hand placed some foliage meshes to break up this this water scene here, right at my detail area, basically, just to get a lot more of a nice silhouette in there and to break up this the rocks. And this is how my scene looks right now. And then, yeah, you can just hit play again as well and run around with the character. As you can see, my FPS are now starting to get really bad. And this is, I think, without ray tracing enabled. So with all of these static meshes that are not instanced, and for example, a lot of foliage and all the movable lights, it just starts to tank performance down. But of course, my graphics card is also not the latest generation. So there's a lot of optimization that could be done there and so on and so forth. But yeah, this is how my scene looks right now at the moment. And in the future tutorials, we are then going to go over all the things that I haven't basically talked about in the previous tutorials. I hope you enjoyed this, and I'm going to see you in the next one.